Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Date in a Blink, where we're joined by expert love coach and international speaker, Diana Eskander. Modern dating sucks, but it doesn't have to. Here on the Date in a Blink podcast, you'll listen in on 10-minute voice-only speed dates between strangers. The experience is designed to move people beyond mindless swiping and marathon messaging. Our position on online dating? It's time to stop collecting pen pals and start, going on actual dates.
Online dating? That actually involves dating? Is that even a thing anymore? But for real, dating should be fun. We hope listening in inspires y'all to try new ways of meeting people. Tune in every other week to hear a new couple go on a date. In between, we'll talk to relationship experts about how the date went and what we can learn from it.
Will our handpicked podcast matches find love on these Blink dates? Or will they say goodbye to each other after 10 minutes and never look back? Tune in to find out.
Before we jump into today's episode, here's a quick word from our sponsors.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain a bit. It's totally free, and Anchor will distribute the podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and lots of other podcasting platforms. Not only that, but it has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. It also lets you make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make your podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Today on Date in a Blink, we're joined by Diana Eskander, expert love coach and founder of School of Love. Diana's helped hundreds of women around the world meet their matches and access deeper layers of love in their existing relationships. She's recently been named top 2 love coach by Yahoo, selected as a TEDx speaker, featured on global TV, and is a contributor to Thrive, making her the go-to for women who crave a different approach to love, one that gets them out of their heads and into their hearts. With that being said, welcome, Diana. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let's dive in. A quote from your website that we really loved was, "Detachment feels like a surrender, almost a deep exhale. While attachment feels like a contraction, taking a deep breath that you don't release until things go your way." And I think as humans, we often associate attachment with something positive and associate detachment with something negative, like the person who seemed awesome until they randomly ghosted you. But in this context, that's not the case. So do you mind explaining a little bit more about the concepts of attachment and detachment as you're using them?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And it's true. We do think of detachment as kind of being like disassociated or avoidant. I really mean it from a more spiritual place in this context. And, attachment is like we're really attached to an outcome and we're gripping on for dear life, like we're really wanting to control how things go. And typically that'll actually really get in the way of, especially if we're talking about, let's say, building a connection with someone, like that intensity of wanting something to work out so badly has you questioning everything you say and really not showing up quite authentically, right? It's like really with this, like it's a means to an end. And the end, let's say, is like hoping this works out, hoping this turns into a relationship. Detachment, like healthy detachment, is I'm going to lead with intention here. Like I want to send this message or I want to do this thing because this is what feels aligned for me. This is what is aligned with my values and, release control of the outcome. And I can think, for example, of when Jack is my husband, when we were dating and we were about 8 months into seeing each other and it was going so well, but it wasn't clear where we were going. And so I had the conversation with him about, this is how I feel about you, and this is what I would love to see for our connection. And that's where I have to detach from the outcome so that I can actually truly give him space to tell me how he feels. But when someone can feel the pressure of like, oh my God, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to fall apart. Like his reaction to that would either be to say something he doesn't really mean to like help hold me together or completely want to avoid the conversation. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me. And it reminds me towards the end of when I was single and still dating, I feel like I had made a similar shift and transition from or really embracing this concept of detachment. Of course, I didn't know that's a way I could think of it, but that's essentially what I did. And it was beautiful because it really allowed me to, I think, have better relationships and ultimately opened up to find the person that I've been happily with for, quite some time now. And so I'm curious, what advice would you give to our listeners so that they can shift their mindset from an attached space into one that's more detached?
Well, a couple of things, like I'll share this mantra sometimes, and some people resonate with it, others don't, but it works well for me when I'm wanting anything, right? So I'll be like, this or something better. So if this specific thing doesn't work out, then I choose to believe that it's because something better for me, not that this person isn't great, but something better for me is on its way, right? So it's this like trusting. And so you're not holding on to it has to absolutely be through this person or, this place or this situation. It's like this or better can really help to shift the perspective, and also to remember that you too are a catch. And that was something that I really noticed was different when I was dating Jack, was like, I was really aware that he was an exceptional catch and that I am too, right? So it's not this like, I need to prove myself. I need to make sure they see my value and want to date me. It's like, I'm just going to leave space for us to explore if this really is a fit for both of us.
So I have a follow-up question on that. So hearing you talk about how we can think about, if this doesn't work out, there's something better out there for us. And I think that's a really healthy way to approach it. But I think in today's age with swiping, there's this feeling of there's always something better if I just keep swiping, like the grass is always greener. So how do you think we can dance on that fine line of having a healthy connection to that feeling without kind of dismissing people too quickly, because we always think that there's, the next best thing if we just keep swiping?
Yeah. So, okay, that's a good question. What I mean when I say this or something better is like you are going in with the intention of exploring this connection authentically, right? So it's not about like, oh, whatever, I'll just find the next best thing. It's like I'm curious about this person. I'm curious about this connection. I'm going to explore it. And I'm not going to I'm not going to grip with control, because I know that if this doesn't work out, that I'm going to trust that it's because something else is meant for me and something else is meant for this person. So again, the key piece is that, but I'm exploring this with intention and like I am open to this connection, right? Versus like, oh, whatever, I'll just like move on to the next.
Yeah, that distinction is really, really great. And I think even just, the intention and the authenticity, like that might be a little bit missing in some scenarios. So that's a really great distinction. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
So another thing that was on your website that I think is worth talking about is the concept of our inner child. And I would love to hear more about what that is and why it's important.
Okay, so oh my God, I love the inner child. and I do so much with the inner child in my work because it really is that important. We have grown up in our physical bodies, yes, but inside of us always remains this version of us that likes to, okay, our inner child is not all bad. Let me just say that. But there is this version of us that hasn't fully grown up. And part of that is beautiful, right? That's like if we access our inner child and how we were as children, we might find some of our innate gifts and strengths and like that natural, not for everybody, but that natural like joy. And there are the fears and the wounds and the tantrums and the ways of relating, right? So if you've ever observed children, let's say when they don't get what they want, for example, they might throw a tantrum or get really, really loud or kind of get outrageous in their behavior. And that can often, like if we don't acknowledge that there's a part of us that exists like that, and there's a part of us that shows up in a relationship like that, like we can throw adult-like tantrums or whatever kind of approach we used as kids, we either witnessed in others or we learned to use to get attention. If we are not aware of those and examine them and evolve, we will bring that same approach when we get triggered in relationships. And then what often happens is like, let's say now you have two adults living together who have unexamined inner children. Then, my inner child can trigger that of my partner's. And so now you have these like two adults arguing as children, and it's not conducive to, adult decisions that we often need to make together, for example.
I think it's really interesting. I was thinking about this recently in the context of family and how we can revert to that inner child in the context of our family. So thinking about it in, relationships, it just really I think makes you realize what a deep impact it can have on us throughout our lives.
Well, absolutely. And there's this, she's a psychotherapist and she talks a lot about conscious parenting. Her name is Dr. Shafali Tsabari. She's brilliant. And she says every child asks these 3 questions. Do you see me? Am I worthy? Do I matter? And if you just take a moment to reflect on your own experiences, I can, and for you too, and for anyone listening, I can guarantee there's been a moment inside of your romantic connections where you've asked one, if not all 3 of those questions. Right? So who do those questions really belong to? It's like this innocent version of ourselves that is still seeking to be loved in the way that we've always wanted. Even if you had excellent parents, right? There's no such thing as perfect parents. And so there's these parts of ourselves that are still always looking for that validation, and the seeking of validation can really sabotage connection if we're not honest about, oh, hey, there's this part of me that sometimes gets insecure. It's not about abandoning it, but just being aware of it and being honest about that it does exist.
Do you think that people, when they're kind of oscillating between those questions in a fight, an argument, or, creating that type of tension, do you think that people have self-awareness? Like, let's say someone who hasn't really done that work or someone who's starting to do that work. Do you find that it's easy for people to notice this in themselves so they can stop themselves? And how do people typically, I guess, when you're directly engaging in a conversation with someone, acknowledge that? I don't know if that question makes sense, though.
Well, I can understand, like, how do you be can people become aware of it and try to shift it, right? I think that's the question.
Yeah, especially when you're really in that triggering moment, because I know sometimes I will know people, and even in myself sometimes, if I'm feeling really anxious about something, or I'm really good at acknowledging my emotions with one person, but it doesn't always translate to somebody else. And I'm just wondering, do you find that people have a hard time, I guess, acknowledging that in that moment and being able to recognize it? Because are you familiar with, what is it called? The critter brain, or scarfing as a term?
No, I mean, like, are you kind of talking about like the amygdala, like the lizard brain?
Yeah. Lizard brain. That's what it is. I was like, I knew it was some type of something in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what happened. So, we can't talk about inner child work or even consciously relating or being in healthy relationships without having an honest conversation about nervous system regulation. Because yes, in the moment where you're feeling triggered or really upset and, your amygdala is like activated and you're in a fight or flight response, it can be really challenging. And that is why, like, doing our work either on our own or with support of a coach or a therapist or groups, is really essential for our continued evolution. So we can really have this like support in continuing to bring awareness, like, oh wow, when I responded in that way at that time, that was my inner child responding. That was my fear responding. So absolutely, like, one of the things that I'll do when I'm feeling triggered is actually just take a moment to call it out to myself and say, I'm feeling triggered right now. So whether I say it out loud, I might do, or I might even say it in within myself. But what that does is actually buy me a moment to breathe and make a choice about how I want to respond. Also knowing that whatever response I'm going to have in this moment likely is skewed by the fact that I'm feeling highly triggered. So then learning to, take deep breaths and ground your feet and notice your body and anchor if you're sitting down, like anchoring into your seat or touching the chair. Like, there's all these ways that take an exceptional amount of practice.
Yeah.
We'll ground ourselves so that in that moment, we're responding with our wise mind, like the prefrontal cortex, and not the amygdala.
Oh, okay. I'm curious, and you don't have to share this if you don't want to, but do you have a specific body sensation when you're in those moments that help act as like a trigger or a tripwire for you for when you feel that way?
And by the way, I'm open to sharing all the things all the time.
Love it.
All the time. Yes, for me, often it'll be like a rising from like the pit of my stomach, kind of like rising up through my chest. And so that's often when I'm working with people, I'll ask them, like, where do you feel the trigger? And if they don't know, like, starting to become aware, like, what happens in your body that lets you know you're being triggered. For some people, it'll be like their face gets really flushed, or their shoulders get really heavy, or their head starts buzzing. And if you can start to bring awareness to that, and then saying to yourself, I'm triggered, it's that moment where you then get to make like the choice instead of reacting. How do you want to respond?
I could probably talk about that all day with you because I'm very interested in it. I find it very fascinating. But I want to shift gears a little bit and transition to something else that I think is really beautiful on your website. So one of the first things that I noticed there was you have this statement, rise in your feminine.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what this means and why it's so significant?
Yeah, absolutely. So knowing, first of all, that I do work primarily with women, I think that that's an important distinction. Although the feminine lives in everyone and can live in everyone, so does the masculine. The feminine energy is really one that is so not passive, right? So we kind of have these like skewed versions of what like it means to be in masculinity or in femininity. I'm not talking about being in a passive state, but the healthy feminine feels relaxed enough to actually like lean back, trust, surrender, observe, take things slow, receive, right? So there's this, I focus a lot on receiving because I've observed, I'll say it that way, in a lot of women, actually on almost all of the women that I've worked with over the years, which is at this point, like really hundreds, maybe close to 1,000, is this idea that we need to give in relationships. And they'll, then I'll hear them say things like, well, I'm just nurturing. And nurturing is actually an essence. It's not an action. Nurturing is not in giving or doing. Nurturing is a way that you feel and a way that people feel around you. And so when we can actually like, if anyone listening to this, regardless of your sexual orientation, if anyone listening to this desires their partner to be more in their masculine, and we want to think about like the yin and yang and the balance, then it requires you to leave space for that person to take that role. And that's going to mean you being more in your feminine. And if you don't understand that concept, and it is a really big concept, like we could do like a whole series on this. It could feel triggering if you don't understand what that really means, because it is, again, it's not a passivity. It's like being in this space of, I don't need to control and make things happen. It's like rather than having this target that you go after, which is more of a masculine energy, you actually get to just like lean back and enjoy and observe the connection and receive what's happening and make decisions as you go. And when you can lean back enough and trust enough, like you do invite the masculine to step up. But what I see is a lot of women taking that masculine role and being frustrated that, in this case, let's say the men they're meeting aren't taking it.
I'm curious, is there, do you find that the reverse is also true? So let's say if there is someone who identifies as a woman, wants to actually step into their more masculine energy and they want their partner to have more feminine energy, is the reverse kind of, is the reverse true in that case? So if in order to allow someone to step into their masculine energy, it requires kind of taking that step back. And I'm sure there's a ton more nuance there. Is it I guess I'm just curious, is it the reverse?
So I think it is really important to mention that there is a ton of nuance, right? And yes, the reverse is absolutely true. It's the yin and the yang, right? So if you desire to be more in your masculine, for example, you would say, you would imagine as that part, like let's say it's the black part of the yin and yang, and so you're like 70% in your masculine and you have your 30% feminine, that circle in the middle. And then you invite the other side to complement you, or vice versa. You want to be 70%. I'm using 70, but I'm just, it's arbitrary. It's the majority, right? So 70% in your feminine, and that circle in the middle is your 30% masculine. And that doesn't mean that that's how you have to operate in all the areas of your life. But if we're talking about polarity in relationships and like what creates that attraction and almost that like tension in a good way, is that balance between the energies. And it does not mean you're always, always, always in the feminine. There are moments where, you are taking on more of the masculine energy, but the idea is like, if you want your partner to be more in that energy, for you to know that you're going to then occupy the other space.
I was going to ask another question on feminine and masculine energies, because you write about it in your blog in connection with creating spaces charged with certain energies. And I feel like that's sort of going along with what you're sharing now. And in that post, you wrote something about your partner that really stood out to us. And it said too, when it comes to creating something you desire, he, quote, loves to learn how to do it best and take his time assembling the pieces in his mind before he assembles them in real life, unquote. And it demonstrates a kind of care and attention that we all could probably benefit from. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about how do you think creating space in relationships allows for this? Or, in connection with the feminine and masculine energies, how you think about that and creating space?
Yeah, I love that question. So another way to think about the feminine and masculine that I think can be helpful here too is like if there's a desire that is a true heart's desire, and again, these things take time to like really feel the difference between, is this a desire that my mind thinks I should want, or is this a desire that comes from a deeper place? So let's say it's coming from a deeper place and it's the heart, your heart has this desire. That's where we can see the heart as kind of the feminine leading the way, and the masculine being the mind coming in to say, great, how can I provide this desire for you? Let me put together the pieces. So that if we apply that model to, let's say, my relationship, and I have this desire that's coming from my heart, and there's something I really want, and I bring it to my partner, and I'm like, I really would love this. And he's like, great, okay, but he's going to pull together the pieces to make it happen. In this case, I think I was specifically talking about like home renos, which he's really, really good at. And there's something I really would love to see come to fruition. Like it just excites me to think we could have this specific type of special paint or whatever it might be. And he's like, okay, great, I want to do that. What becomes key there for me in my work is to lean back and give him the space I know he needs to start to like learn about the process and get excited about the process and feel confident in doing it. And then he's going to create it and make it happen. And I've learned that about him specifically, right? And so there's this space, and inside of that space is so hard for us because we have to have trust that something's going to come to fruition. And sometimes we have lots of evidence that it won't, right? But it's this space of, let's say, giving someone the dignity of their own process, or the space of allowing our partners to be on their own journeys too. Like you might see me mention that piece a lot, like let him be on his own journey too. It's the space between, let's say, question and response, right? We typically want things right away. Like if I ask you a question, I want to know what's your answer. But sometimes it means allowing space of days, even weeks, for the person to mull it over and reflect on it, especially if they haven't considered it before. So there's this whole idea around space. How much space do we take from talking about problems? How much space do we take from thinking about our partner or, this new person that I've just met that I'm really excited about? How much space do I take from seeing them or talking about them? The concept of space in relationships just continues to blow me away. Like when you really become aware of what feels like too little or too much and you kind of dance with it, it's like a critical piece in creating healthy relationships.
It's interesting. I feel like Laura and I talk about this a lot in our relationship, obviously not a romantic one, but we just think about things very differently. And when we share ideas with each other, I think often we forget that we have to give the other time and space to process it in their own way. And so it's really interesting to hear about you talk about it, because I can see it in relationships, like both romantic and partnerships and other forms. So that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
You're so welcome.
It's amazing. It's such a simple but nuanced and deep topic on how impactful conversation is into all of our interpersonal relationships. And I always find it funny how sometimes we're willing to apply certain, I think, nuance to conversations in the workplace and in relationships, and not always in both. So I love, Talia, that you kind of brought up that this is also applicable in more than just a romantic relationship. Obviously, like, depending on what the nature of it is, but I just think it's really beautiful to see what those connections look like.
Yeah, and it absolutely relates. And it's kind of like it's almost the same thing if you bring it back to the masculine and feminine. It's like if one is really good at numbers and the other is really good at marketing, and you both want to really like mostly take those roles and sometimes dabble in the other, but the one who's good in marketing is always like nitpicking at the numbers and focusing on the numbers. It's like you're not giving the space for each person to shine in their gift, right? And like it's that complement that makes it work really well.
And speaking of compliments and first dates in this case, so curious, transitioning a little bit to Ruby and Elliot's date, what were some moments when you felt like they really hit their conversational stride? Or if you didn't feel like they did, what do you think held them back from hitting a conversational stride?
And there were a couple of moments, like at first I found it was more Elliot kind of, it almost sounded like interviewing Ruby at the start. And then there was a point where they actually just like, rather than the focus being him asking her questions, which is nice, you know, he's showing interest and curiosity, they were doing more of a back and forth. It felt like after the halfway mark that they were just kind of like actually not deflecting, but asking each other questions and reflecting back to each other.
I noticed that as well, especially with the, it's so interesting that you say that it seems like a little more like an interview the first few minutes, and then the second half was a lot more, I think, natural and free flowing. I think for me, I felt like the beginning part was, you know, like the awkwardness, the jitters, trying to, you know, get to know someone, do that little dance. There's a little bit of small talk. And then the second part of it, when they were talking about, you know, a shared mutual interest, like just hearing that animation in their voice and how I think it shifted the energies of the conversation.
Completely.
I thought that was pretty great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there was another part to your question too. I mean, I have a couple of remarks.
Yeah, would love to hear them.
So yeah, I mean, at first it felt like the focus was more Elliot asking Ruby questions. And again, like it takes like so much empathy. It takes time to like get into that like conversational stride with someone you don't know. And it can feel like a little bit of pressure. What I found was good was when they started to ask each other questions. I found towards the end too, like Ruby, you could see like she was being herself. You could sense like she was comfortable. She was talking about like the things she did like, she didn't like, and she was just letting the conversation flow. Where I felt like there could have been some room for like more connection would be like how do I say this? Like a little bit more warmth and almost like flirtatiousness could come in if they felt the connection, you know, to maybe give someone a compliment or say, oh, I really like that. You sound really cool. Or it sounds like you're really interesting. Or, oh, I love that we have some of the same interests, you know, just to kind of like bridge that gap and actually feel connected to the other person versus just like kind of like, what do you like? What do I like? What kind of terrains? You know what I mean?
So that's actually a great comment. It leads me to our next question, which we still want to hear if you have more thoughts. But despite the obvious constraints of time, did you feel like Elliot and Ruby were able to use their 10 minutes in a way that enabled them to better understand who the other person is?
It was very focused on, I mean, who the other person is. I mean, I don't think that can really truly be done. I felt Ruby showed more of herself in the conversation than perhaps Elliot did. But in all fairness, I think he was trying to keep the focus on being interested in her and what she had to say. So, yeah, I mean, I thought that they did a great job at kind of talking about things that are actually interesting versus like, you know, small talk. It was like they actually got into their interests. But there was a sense of, again, it is only 10 minutes, but there was a sense of like, just like a little flair missing. There was like moments that felt more serious where they could have just been a little bit playful and maybe reflected to each other something that they liked about each other. But in terms of, you know, showing who they are, I think they did what they could in the short period of time.
That kind of leads to the $1 million question. Date in the blank, what did you think? Do you think that they matched? And I'd love to know why or why not.
I think that they matched in terms of interest. I think that Ruby was showing a bit more spunk than Elliot. However, I have no doubt that Elliot, given more space and time, would show more of himself. So I actually think it deserves a second chance for sure. And I always tell people, like, on the first date, and this isn't even a full first date, right? The only question you really want to answer is, do I want to see this person again? Right? There's nothing like, you don't want to ask these really big questions about like, could this be the person for me? Like, that's a lot of pressure. But just like, is there something there that leaves some curiosity to want to see or talk to this person again? And I would say in this case, based on like just all the, intersection of their interests, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to do a big +1 to everything you just said. There's only so much you can glean from a 10-minute first date with someone. And so I love that you boiled the essence of everything down to, do I want to see this person again? And so my thoughts on it are very similar to yours. I did think that in terms of matching, I definitely thought that they would want to continue the conversation because at a minimum, there's so many, or not so many, but there was at least a few highlights of shared interests that I think could really keep a conversation going between them. But Tali, I'm curious. We're curious. We got to know. What did you think? And did they match?
So I wasn't sure if they would match after the date because I think sort of to what you were saying, Diana, they talked about similar interests, but they didn't seem to, pierce the, are we interested in getting to know each other further, beyond our mutual interests, because mutual interests are, a great thing to bond over, but that isn't necessarily the foundation of a relationship, like a long-term one. You need a lot more than that. So I wasn't sure, from their perspective, if that was enough to get to the second date or, second conversation. Turns out it was. So they did match. It didn't seem like it went very much further. We do email them afterwards and we didn't hear back from both parties, but it seems like maybe it fizzled out. We don't have a ton of details, but after the initial date that they did match. So you were both right and had, pretty spot on instincts. And as we wrap up, a question we love to ask all of our experts, Diana, we're wondering if you have any quick words of wisdom for our audience, besides everything you've already shared.
I think it's really important to just like open your heart to the experience, that it's not just about like, oh, I'm going to meet a person and that's going to be my person, but it's like connecting human to human, right? So like if you can go in with that perspective, again, it takes the pressure off. Like you don't have to meet the one. I don't believe there is only one, right? And it's like, if you can keep your heart open, like all I'm doing today is connecting to another human. I think it really just like allows for the potential to exist. And really, like for the potential to exist, we do need to release the pressure. So like allow this to be an outlet, an outlet of possibility of where you can possibly meet someone. And remember that you're just talking to another human.
That's my favorite approach to dating. Removing the pressure, just remembering that key question you mentioned earlier, like, do I want to get to a second date? Not, is this my person, my only person, the one?
Yes.
It just makes it so much more fun and reduces that pressure, like you said. So that is perfect advice, I think.
Wonderful.
And as a final question, how can our audience get connected with you?
Thank you for that. Well, a great place to start would be my website. So dianaeskander.com. I share a lot on Instagram as well. So at dianaeskander_. And then from there, you can always send me a message, say hello, and I can tell you a little bit about where else you can find me. But those would be great places to begin.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you again for chatting with us today and sharing all of this with us. We're so happy to have you and so grateful for your wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we've got for you today. Shoot us a message on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at @TheBlinkDate or at Date in a Blink to let us know what you think. If you want to try voice first speed dating from the comfort of your home, download the Blink Date app today. You can also sign up to participate in Date in a Blink by visiting our website at www.theblinkdate.com. In the meantime, thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed listening and look forward to talking with you again next time.